One time I was out fishing, I was in this pool, and I had it all to myself. The fish were rising, the weather was perfect. I was having a great time. Then, 5-10 minutes after I got to this pool, I see these two guys come out of the bushes upstream. They walk downstream right to where I was fishing. They get in the head of the pool, and they start casting really heavy lures. They were spin fishing, really heavy lures right through that pool. And I looked at them, and I was like, guys, could you please not? I was here first. This pool's not big enough for all three of us, let alone two guys with really big lures. Could you guys please go fish somewhere else? And they looked at me like I just hit on their sister, and they grumbled and they got really upset with me. So who's in the wrong here? Well, we're going to talk about that and a bunch more about river etiquette on today's episode of Untangled. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Company. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durrant. We've got a wonderful little show lined up for you today. Really excited, as usual. If I ever get not excited to be here, that's going to be a problem, but luckily I don't think that's going to happen. Really quick, though, before we dive into the show, if you could take a second and rate the show wherever you're listening to it, even if you are listening to it via the Pony Express, give us a rating over there as well. It just helps the show reach more people. Hopefully we can broaden the community a little bit and continue to help as many folks as possible have a really great day out on the water. So take a second, rate the show, and if you haven't already, definitely subscribe. Okay, if you're subscribed on Apple or Spotify or YouTube, it doesn't matter. Just click that little subscribe button, follow along with us so you don't miss a second of potentially award-winning podcast right here. We haven't won any awards yet or even been nominated for any awards yet, but that doesn't mean that we are not a potentially award-winning show. So you definitely don't want to keep this to yourself, do you? It's a good thing I make myself laugh because, goodness, I need it. Well, we are going to be talking, like you heard in the show intro, we're going to be talking about river etiquette today. We're also going to be talking about sling packs versus vests, how to rig a dry dropper to avoid tangles, loose reels on your fly rod, and fishing with guides. So a lot of fun topics that I think we're all going to get quite a bit out of. Now, I do want to open the show with some more short questions, just like I've done before. So another reminder, if you have any shorter questions that you don't think merit a really long, in-depth answer, please submit those anyways. There's always a link to submit questions in the podcast description. These are a great little questions to start the show off with. So Barry from North Carolina is starting the show off for us today. Barry writes in, he's got two questions. He says, one, I'm considering switching from a sling pack to a vest. Curious to hear your opinion on the two. Space is not an issue, just convenience sometimes. And then his second question, seeking advice on the best way to rig a double nymph or dry dropper to reduce tangles. I learned about VFC from ordering your starter fly box with the labeled compartments. It has served me well. Thanks and great job with the show. Barry, thank you. Really appreciate it. I'm really glad that you got one of our starter fly boxes and enjoyed it. They're actually really, I remember the first time I saw them, I was like, oh, this is actually better than I expected, right? And you say that, and it's almost like demeaning, and that's obviously I'm not going to sit here and demean our products, right? But it's, you buy it and you're like, oh, well, we'll see what we get. It exceeds expectations. There's even a couple of them stacked behind me. If you're watching the podcast, you can see them stacked up behind me on my filthy tying desk. And speaking of filthy tying desks, do not trust anybody who tells you they tie, but they have a clean desk. Okay, they're a liar at that point. Nobody who ties has a clean desk. Oh, well, Barry, let me answer your questions here, all right? Your first one, I used to use a vest all the time. I had 3 or 4 different vests, loved them. Then I ended up using a new chest pack because I was reviewing some chest packs, and I did not think I was going to like that chest pack. I thought I was going to hate it. Just knowing how I like to carry my gear, I was like, oh, the chest pack's going to get in the way of everything. I'm going to snag my fly line on it, and I'm just going to sit there cursing the whole time. That's not what happened. I ended up falling in love with it, and now it's all I use. I haven't worn my fishing vest in, going on 2 years now. It's been a minute. So if I had to choose, though, between like a sling pack and a vest, I'd take a vest every single day. I do not like having to swing my sling around to get to my fly boxes or anything else. It's just not what I like to do. I've got plenty of fishing buddies that love their slings. They just don't work for me. With a vest, I really like how everything's just right there when you need it. There's no swinging it around. There's no worrying about that. You just zip open the pocket, boom, everything's right there. Yes, vests can certainly weigh a lot more down on your shoulders. They can wear your shoulders and your neck out more than a sling. A sling, usually a little bit better about distributing the weight. And vests usually, not usually, but some of them can be less spacious than a lot of sling packs. You're probably going to have more space for like water or some snacks in your sling compared to a vest. But I will take ease of access to my gear that I get with the vest. To me, that outweighs any of the potential extra comfort that I might get out of a sling. And I've just never worn them long enough, but I've never worn a sling that was as comfortable as my vest for me. So you ask my opinion, then that's where that's at. I'm certainly not over here hating on sling pack wearers. I don't want to start anything there. If that's what works for you, well, wonderful. I'll tip my hat to you. Just not my cup of tea. Now, for your second question about how do we rig a double nymph for a dry dropper to reduce tangles? Well, always tie the dropper section of tippet off the bend of the hook of the first fly in your rig. So don't try to tie it through the eye of the hook. Always go off the bend of the hook. So that's your first step. And then try as hard as you can to avoid using anything smaller than 5X tippet, because once you get down below that, it really loves to tangle. Even 5X tangles a lot more than I really like. I usually use 4X on just about everything, unless I am fishing a single dry fly in a place where they are actually tippet shy. That's something that I think the fly fishing community doesn't, not the community, that's the wrong way to phrase it. I think we as anglers have the perception that we have to use thinner line, lighter line as much as possible. And that's not true. We can use heavier line than I think we realize, because I rope up to 3 or 4X consistently, and it's not a problem out here. Even on the small streams, it's really not a problem. It's only when you get into really slow moving water or heavily pressured areas where they get to be tippet shy that you actually do have to size down. But that's what I'd recommend. Make sure you're tying it off the bend of the hook and using the thickest tippet you can. That will tangle less. And then we've actually got a whole bunch of information about rigging up a dry dropper on the VFC blog. So I'll go ahead and link that in the podcast description for you. Thanks, Barry. Appreciate your questions to get the show started for us today. Now, let's go right ahead and dive into the main part of the show. Our first question comes to us from Ian from Pennsylvania. And Ian, I know you're not for the first from Pennsylvania now. I thought somebody else was the first from Pennsylvania a while ago, and they ended up being like the third or fourth from Pennsylvania. So I'm just going to quit saying that, because apparently I can't remember where anybody is from. So Ian's question, he writes in and says, first of all, thank you for the podcast. It's a great listen while in the car or at the office. You're darn right. Listen to me at the office. Don't do your work. Yeah, listen to me. I'll help you be way more productive. Oh, my question. My 5-weight rod does not have a locking nut on the reel seat. It only has the threaded ring that holds the reel on, but no second nut to hold that one in place. Consequently, the reel starts to come loose after a handful of casts and needs to be tightened again. Are there any methods to create an aftermarket lock on this? Are there any sort of adjustable threaded nuts that I could add? or some sort of thick rubber band that can be put on there. Any suggestions on the best method here would be much appreciated. Well, Ian, your question made me remember I was out fishing with a guide a while ago, and he had an older fly rod that he handed me. And when I'm on guide trips, I usually just use the guide's rods. It's easier. It's already rigged up. I don't have to worry about hauling my stuff. The exception is if the guide's like a buddy of mine, and then, sometimes I'll bring my stuff because it's less of a guided trip at that point and more of just two guys fishing together and one of us paying the other a lot of money. Anyways, so my guide buddy, he hands me this rod, and the reel seat looked all sorts of funky, man. It had seen some better days. Okay. And I'm looking at it like, what's going on here? Well, it turns out that he'd had one of his wife's hair ties wrapped underneath the sliding band, and that locked his reel right in place because the locking nut on this rod had broken somehow. So he just grabbed a hair tie from his wife's nightstand, I'm assuming, put it on there, and it worked. The reel didn't really slip very much at all throughout the day. It was kind of a genius little move, and I think the hair tie is a little bit more durable than a rubber band. So I think that's why he opted for the hair tie. I don't actually remember asking. I just remember looking at it thinking, oh, that's cool. Huh, that works. And it really did work. So you certainly could use a hair tie to secure your reel if that if that threaded nut you're talking about, if that just is too loose, try putting a hair tie underneath it, see if that works. But if your 5-weight only ever came with a single threaded ring, then that really should be all that you need to keep that reel secure. I actually went out and looked at a bunch of my 5-weights just so I would remember, but a lot of my 5-weight rods only have a single threaded ring to hold the reel in place. I just took niece and nephew fishing yesterday, and I was thinking about this when I went out there, and because I had both my a couple of my 5-weights. Remember, hashtag more fly rods than friends, right? Well, I'm out there and I was paying attention to putting the reel on, and it was a single threaded nut on both of these 5-weights, and they're both new one was from Douglas and one was from Reddington. So they're not obscure brands at all, right? They got a pretty big part of the market here, and they were single threaded nuts. So that makes me think that your fly rod probably never came with another nut, like you said, because it didn't need it. So you should be able to tighten that one down enough to keep your reel in place. And if not, that might be a warranty issue. So you might want to look into having the company fix that. It certainly is possible that you're just not tightening it down enough. So I'd recommend try tightening it down even more than you think you can, or contacting the company about a warranty issue. They might be able to repair it, because short of ripping the reel seat off and adding a new threaded ring yourself, the hair tie option is going to be your best bet here. So hopefully one of those helps you out, Ian. Thank you very much. Appreciate you taking the time to send that question in. All right, now let's get into kind of the meat and potatoes of the show here. Cameron from Colorado writes in, says, "Hi, Spencer. I'm a big fan of the podcast, and I count down the days until a new episode comes out." Dude, me too. I count them down too. I really love doing this, but thank you. All these compliments are not going to be good for my ego. I hope everybody listening understands that. And I hope everybody listening understands that I was being tongue in cheek. Okay, I try to keep my ego in check here. Now, whether or not that's successful, I guess Alex in Berkeley can tell you. No, all kidding aside, 100% serious for a second. Cameron, thank you very much. I really do appreciate it. Now, we'll get back to Cameron's question here. He says, "My question is in regards to river etiquette. Could you please go over the basics of it? How much space should I give other people on the river? Should I go upstream or downstream of them? All those kinds of things. By the way, Diet Coke for the win. Coke Zero doesn't have any caffeine in it. Thanks for all the help and guidance." Well, Cameron, I showed that last little bit of your question to Alex, and he took great offense to the Coke Zero doesn't have any caffeine in it, because I think it actually has more caffeine in it than Diet Coke. But Diet Coke is 100% superior. So you are still correct on that. It does taste a lot better. And that's really something that I've been paying attention to lately since this whole Diet Coke, Coke Zero fracas has been going on here on the show. And Diet Coke's it's just got that taste. It's just Diet Coke, and Coke Zero is not, and Diet Coke's just better. So it's science fact. Okay, I'm sorry. Oh, well, this is going to be a really good question, Cameron. Thank you for sending this in. Everybody else, buckle up because you're going to be in for a ride here. All right, we got some stuff to go over. I went through this question and really pulled out 4 main points that I want to tackle. Those 4 points here are: how much room should we give other anglers? What to do when you're walking like behind or in front of other anglers? Standing in an awkward spot, trying to shoulder another angler out of the way, and then camping in one spot for the whole day. We're going to hit those 4 things because I think those really get at the meat of like 99% of river etiquette problems that I've observed and that I've been part of out on the river. Because again, I'm not talking about river etiquette from a place of, oh, well, I've never done this. I am so much better than all you peasants who've never made somebody else uncomfortable on the water. No, I've done my fair share of dumb things, especially early on in fly fishing. I've had awful river etiquette, and I'm the first to admit it because I know I done screwed up. So this is coming from a place of, I think we're all going to make mistakes like this. Most of the time, it's unintentional. I'd say that probably 90% of the time, a river etiquette mistake is unintentional. It's the 10% that leaves a really bad taste in your mouth. So hopefully, once we're done with this, we can get to the point where we're reducing the unintentional river etiquette mistakes that we make. Now, I want to illustrate the first of these 4 points, which was how much room we should give other anglers. I want to illustrate this by expanding on the story I shared in the intro of the show about those spin anglers. I was on the Provo River in Utah, the lower Provo. And if you've ever fished there, you've seen some poor river etiquette plenty of times. The issue with that wasn't that they were spin fishing, right? Contrary to popular belief, and I spin fish still, not a ton, but I still do. It's a fun way to fish sometimes. But the issue wasn't that they were spin fishing. The issue is that they were just way too close. That pool I was on was big enough for 1 angler, not 3, and certainly not 2 spin anglers and 1 fly angler. So that was the issue there. I don't care if you think it's enough room. I don't care if you're like, oh yeah, this isn't going to bother them. Stop and think before you get too close to another angler. My general rule of thumb is I don't want people coming close to me if I wouldn't feel comfortable fishing with them right there. Now, it's really river dependent, right? On the lower Provo River, for example, it's a crowded fishery. You know that going into it. You do not expect a 1/4 mile shoulder room on either side of you. That's just not reality. That's not going to happen on the Provo and a lot of our crowded rivers. The Madison would probably be another good example. During prime season on the Madison, it's just not realistic to expect to have a huge stretch of river to yourself. That being said, 50 yards, I don't know. I feel like 50 yards is a pretty good buffer on either side. If you can give somebody about 50 yards, that's enough room that you're not kind of jumping in on their stuff. But at the same time, think of where they're fishing, how they're fishing. You don't want to potentially ruin the fishing upstream for them. Just give folks as much room as you possibly can. That's what it boils down to at the end of the day. Give other anglers as much room as possible. And if they're like, hey, you're getting a little close, could you please move? Unless they're like hollering at you from, half a mile down the river, like, hey, you're way too close. Can you move? Yeah, could you? And you can't even hear them, right? You just know they're angry. Okay, that's ridiculous. That guy, that angler just needs to go sit down, sit in his truck, and count his gold bullion and get over himself Okay, that's what needs to happen with that fella. All right. Within reason, just give folks as much space as you possibly can. That is a really good rule of thumb to live by. Now, if you're walking up and down a river and you have to walk past another angler and the bank's kind of tight and it's just kind of tight, always stick to the bank as close as much as you can and then walk behind them. Do not walk in front of another angler. I've had that done to me. I was on the Provo and I was sitting there nymphing and some guy walked right through the middle of where my indicator was drifting and snagged one of my flies on his boot. And I just looked at him and he looked at me and was like, "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see you there." Oh, okay. Yeah, you didn't. All right, buddy. Cool. Well, you just ruined the whole run. Great. And I was pretty upset about that. But always go behind folks if you can. All right. And ask too. You get up to somebody and say, "Hey, I'm going to get behind you here. Is that okay?" 99.9% of the time, no other angler is going to be upset that you walk behind them to get up the river. And then once you've walked behind them to get up or down the river, whatever direction you're going, stay, pretty far behind them until you feel like, okay, I've given them enough space. Now I'm going to walk back out into the river. I'm not going to ruin the run that they're fishing. And I'm going to set up shop here myself. That's a good rule of thumb to live by. Just what would you be comfortable with and communicate with folks out on the water. I've actually met some pretty good fishing buddies because I was like, "Hey, can I cut behind you there and get up?" And, "Oh yeah, sure you can. Hey, are you catching some fish today?" Yeah. "Oh, what are you catching them on?" Next thing you know, we've been there for a half hour, caught fish together. We're making plans to fish again next week. All right. That happens a lot. Anglers are a pretty friendly bunch, especially these days. So don't be afraid to talk to somebody, because if you show that you, by talking to them, by asking them, you're showing them, "Hey, I'm trying to not screw up your fishing. I'm trying to make sure that we can all coexist on the river together." That goes a long way. There's always going to be those grumpy codgers who aren't going to be happy no matter what, but screw them. All right. There's nothing we can do about folks like that. The vast majority of people are going to be really glad that you said, "Oh yeah, can I go by you?" "Oh sure, not a problem at all. Come on right behind me." Folks are really going to appreciate that. But make sure that you do that. Now, a couple other stories that I want to share on river etiquette, right? My 2 points where I said you don't want to stand in an awkward spot and try to shoulder another angler out of the way so that you can get into their run. You don't want to camp in one spot for all day. I've got some stories that are going to illustrate that. Once again, I was on the lower Provo River because it was just a wonderful place for poor river etiquette if you ever want to see it, because folks tend to not talk to you up there. They just go. A little bit of entitlement out there, which is kind of sad to see, but I do think that attitude is changing. It's not been that bad in a long time. Well, I'm out there on the Provo during a really, really good blue wing hatch, and blue wings on the Provo is phenomenal. It is a great little hatch on the Provo. And I'd gotten to this run. I'd been fishing it for maybe 10, 15 minutes. I had not been in this run very long. And it's a big enough run that people get around me, but it wasn't big enough. The flows were down low, so it wasn't big enough for multiple people to fish this run. It's a pretty small little spot. But the fish were rising pretty good right there, and I was putting the hurt on them. I was having a good time, catching a few. Even I'd only been on it 10, 15 minutes. I probably caught 2 or 3 already. So it was a pretty productive little run. Well, people start stacking up behind me in the river, and there were 2 or 3 guys that just started shouldering their way up closer and closer. And every time I'd turn around and look, they were closer. They were 5, 6 feet closer every single time. They just kept doing that, trying to make me uncomfortable so that I'd leave and they could fish that run. Okay, don't do that. That is a big no. If you want to fish that run, park yourself downstream a respectable distance and wait until the angler moves on. Which leads me into another story from the Provo River. I was out fishing. I think it was in the dead of winter. And the Provo's it's known for being a great nymph fishery too. And there's this one hole that guys just love to camp on and fish. And it's great. They'll camp there for, an hour or so, really work it, and then they'll finally move on. Well, I noticed I got in and I walked upstream and this guy was in this hole and I was like, oh, cool. I'll come down and fish it maybe on my way out, because he was in the hole and I wasn't planning on being there for super long. Well, I ended up being there for like 5 hours that day. And when I walked back downstream, that guy was still there in the same spot. He was just camped out. He wanted to be in the best spot in the river, and he wasn't going to move for nothing. Now, there's nothing that says he has to move, right? There's no rule that says he has to move. But if you're in a spot that's known to be like the honey hole or one of the best spots, and there's a ton of other people on the river that day, and you can clearly see they're like eyeing you like, hey, how long are you going to be fishing that spot? I'd like to give it a try. Do the right thing and just don't hog the spot. That's something else that I feel pretty strongly about, because you're not learning as an angler. If you just fish the same hole every single time, you're not broadening your skill set. You're not doing anything to better yourself as an angler. And then you're taking away from the experience on the river for everybody else. So just try and balance that. I'm not telling you, you have to just give up the spot the minute somebody asks for it, but don't sit and camp in one spot the whole day. That's just not what we want to do when we're out on the water. So Cameron, I hope that those stories answer your question. I hope that gives everybody listening a good overview of what river etiquette is, why it's important. Yes, it still matters, especially these days. Rivers are a lot more crowded than they used to be. Thanks a bunch, COVID. We really appreciate that. Learning how to fish with each other is something that we all need to know how to do. It's not going to change anytime soon. A lot of the folks that picked up fly fishing in the last couple of years seem like they're sticking with it. So the rivers are going to be more crowded. We've got to learn to be able to fish with each other. And the number one thing there is just communicate. Ask somebody before you start walking behind them. Don't walk in front of them. If they're fishing a hole that you really want to fish, there's no harm in saying, hey, how long are you going to be there? And, coming up and fishing that when they're done. But don't sit there and edge them out. Don't do the little shuffle up the river when they're not looking, so that you're closer every time they turn around, so that they get uncomfortable and leave. Don't do those things. And don't camp in one hole the whole day. So, if you got any other questions about river etiquette, please send them in. I'd love to answer. And just like that, we are rolling up on the last question of the show. So just one more reminder, everybody, before we go. Please, if you've got questions, submit them so that we can answer them here on the podcast. That's what keeps this wonderful little podcast going around, is your questions. Send them on in, and I'll do my best to make sure that I'm entertaining while I answer your questions for you as well. And then please, once again, rate the show wherever you're listening to it and subscribe. Last question today comes to us. Adam from Texas writes in and says, I normally fish with a guide. At what point should I try fishing on my own? Excuse me. Adam, that's a really interesting question. First off, congrats that on your fishing trips, you can usually go with a guide. That is, and I'm not being glib here, that's wonderful, because you're probably learning a whole bunch by going with guides that often. I didn't fish with a guide for like a decade when I started fly fishing. I mean, I fished with my dad, and he's the one who taught me how to fish, but it was not a guided trip, because it was, here, take this, stand up there, don't get in my way. No, it wasn't quite like that. My dad's awesome. My dad's the best dad. Like, if I can be half the dad that my dad was, dude, I'll have it made at this point, right? Well, it's different though, right? Because fishing with your dad is just different from a guide. The guide's there to make sure that you have a super great time, and your dad usually is too, but it's just a different kind of dynamic. Well, my first guided trip that I ever went on was amazing. I think it was on the Green, actually. I think my first guided trip was on the Green River in Utah. And guides are certainly worth their money. Good ones, anyways. They are worth every penny that they make. With that said, though, there's never a bad time to start fishing on your own. And with as much as you're learning from the guide, Adam, I would wager that you are going to learn way more by your own failures than if you always go out with a guide, because guides are making their money by showing you just a wonderful time. They will often step in to correct bad behaviors or help you avoid making mistakes. And that's great. That's what a good guide is supposed to do. That's what we want to see our guides doing. We want to see them teaching, not just putting as many fish in the net as possible. That's part of guide culture that I think is changing. And I think it's changing in part because us as anglers are realizing that it is less about the numbers and more about the experience. That's something we can get into on another podcast. But that is one way to learn, though, if you have a guide who is always stepping in to correct your bad behaviors or to prevent you from making mistakes. But I think a lot of us learn really effectively by making a mistake, remembering how that mistake felt, and then avoiding that mistake in the future. I see that with my own students, right? I teach high school, and when they make mistakes in their papers, I teach English. When they make mistakes in their papers, I correct them, I hand it back. I've done everything I can to try and prevent them from making that mistake. They still make it, hand it back to them, and usually once they see that, they start to self-correct and they make that mistake less and less often until finally, we get to the end of the school year and they're not making those mistakes anymore. It's that same concept with fly fishing. You've got to make some of those to learn what it feels like to mess up and then correct from it. And I think that's when the learning starts to become more powerful. So really, to answer your question, Adam, start fishing on your own right now. Get out there, go have some fun, make some mistakes, get skunked. You're not going to enjoy that part of it. Nobody enjoys not catching fish, right? But you're going to learn quite a bit from it. And I think those lessons are going to stick with you a lot longer than the lessons that you learned from the probably very excellent guides that you've been able to go out fishing with. So thank you very much for that question, Adam. Really appreciate it. And everybody who tuned in for the show this week, and all the other weeks, just a big heartfelt thank you. The show, this is episode 24, and I think that's really kind of cool. I mean, I know it's not a ton of episodes in the grand scheme of things, but we're cruising. We're folks that are listening to the show. We're building that community. We're just having a great time. All of us here at VFC are just really excited about what we're doing with the show and the community we're building here. So please share the show with folks you know, even folks that you don't know. Stand on a street corner, hand out pamphlets with a QR code to the show for us, right? Evangelize. Oh, just kidding. Don't do that. That'll make us look like a cult. And, well, I guess fly fishing is kind of a cult. So maybe do it anyways, right? What does it matter? Oh, well, seriously, thanks to everybody who takes the time to listen. Appreciate it. And until next week, tight lines.